you can hear me. My name is Helge Stveiten, and good evening to those of you who are connecting from Scandinavia, and good afternoon to those of you who are here in the United States. This is an event that is hosted by the American Scandinavian Society here in the US. I have the pleasure of moderating this event, which has the exciting title With Restoration Through Hellgate to the Promised Land. And what we will do at this meeting is to invite you to a journey back close to 200 years in time, to another journey that actually happened in June of 1825, who happened to be become the birth of modern immigration from Norway to the US. And as we know, this journey has shaped the lives of hundreds of thousands of people now living in the United States, and some of them are in the room today. Although we live through rather strange times, one of the beauties of the lockdown and the pandemic is this. We are sitting in our homes on both sides of the Atlantic, and we will in a few seconds enjoy a live journey back to the 1820s. Quite remarkable. We have the good fortune of having Anne Elisebeth Skogen with us today to make this story come alive. Anne Elisebeth is a professional storyteller, and she's joining us today from the municipality of Sand outside of Stavanger, Norway, where this story actually took place and started up less than almost 200 years ago. So the game plan for this meeting is fairly simple. We will have a 45 minutes presentation or story presented by Anne, followed by a Q&A, and then we have a little surprise for you towards the end of the meeting. The chat box can be used for questions. The host is muting you when the presentation is taking place. And if you do have a question, you need to flag that so that you can be unmuted. However, before we kick it off, I'd like to, and I'm honored to give the floor to the president. It's not the president, but a very good substitute. Lars Nielsen, president of ASS. Lars, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Helge. The American Scandinavian Society is a volunteer organization based here in New York. We were organized in 1908 to strengthen cultural ties between the Nordic cultures and the United States. Please visit our website, americanscandinavian.org, for more information about us. As he mentioned, Helge is our vice president for Norway, and he has brought us this afternoon's very informative program. We are approaching 2025, which will be the 200th anniversary of the arrival in New York of the tiny sloop Restauration and the beginning of Norwegian emigration to America. As stated on the back of a special Porsgrunn china plate to commemorate this event, quote, "These pioneers, the 800,000 immigrants who follow them, and their descendants have made significant contributions to everyday life in America," unquote. Only Ireland has a larger percentage of citizens who emigrated to the US. Norway had 40% of their citizens coming here. That's a big percentage when you think about it. So let us, thank you. Now we'll revert back to Helge, and he'll introduce our guests from Norway. Thank you for attending this meeting.
Thank you so much, Lars. Appreciate it. Without further ado, we'll go over to the start of the show, Anne Elisebeth Skogen, with her presentation. So Anne, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And hello, all of you from one of the fjords in Norway. I'm so grateful to tell you the story about the first immigrant from Norway to America. There is two things I especially have noticed working with this story. The first thing is that two of the sloopers, two of the men who left in 1825, was born and raised in the municipality where I'm now living. And Restoration, the boat, was bought in Egersund, my hometown. So in a way, this is local history for me. At the same time, it's a very important part of the Norwegian national history. The second thing I'll mention is that I've learned that different families have different stories, tradition about what happened on board Restoration. So sometimes there is many versions of the same story. So sometimes I have had to choose version. So the story you know will listen to is my version, because I have had to choose, because my task has been to make a continuous story understandable for everyone. The last thing I have to ask you for is, please listen to my story with your heart, not to my English language.
No, I'll have your cereal first.
It was a sunny and windy day in July in the year 1825. In the harbor of Stavanger, a little sailing ship, 54 feet long, was moored at one of the piers. But there were a lot of people on board, more than 50. They were packed together up on the deck, men and women, young people and children. And they were all ready to leave Norway and cross the vast Atlantic Ocean to America. Soon they would wave goodbye to friends and family forever. Who were these people, and why did they leave their home? The leader of the group was a man named Lars Geiland. Lars Geiland was born and grew up on a small farm close to the city of Stavanger. When he was a boy, his father died and he had to help his mother to run the small farm. But often he was down at the port and looked at different sailing ships that come from different countries. And he had a dream, the little boy, once to be a sailor himself. When Lars was about 20 years old, he got hired on a boat bound for Spain. That was in the year 1807. In 1807, the Napoleonic Wars were in progress in Europe. And when Lars and the crew sailed through the English Channel, their boat were taken under arrest and the crew put in the British English prison. That means they come on one of the prisoners' ship. There were very bad conditions on board. But after a time, they got visit of people that handed out food, gave them religious books to read, and told them about their faith. These people later were called Quakers. One of them was named William Allen. After 7 long years in the prison, when the Napoleonic Wars finally ended in 1814, Lars Geiland had converted to the Quakers. And when the other prisoners went home, Lars Geiland went to London and stayed there for a time to learn more English and more about the Quakers. And he stayed at home by William Allen's mother, Margaret Allen. But after a time, he went back home to Stavanger. And then he regularly gathered families and friends in his small farmhouse and told them about his new faith. This meeting continued, and in the year, it was in August 1818, William Allen came to visit from London. And then Lars Geiland invited to meeting day after day. And people came, not only from the area around Stavanger, they also come from islands and villages in the fjords. And not only adult people, young people came sailing as well. On one of the meetings in 1818, the first Norwegian Quakers community was founded. The Quakers did not want to baptize their children in the Norwegian church. They did not want to marry in church, and they did not want to be buried of a priest. Not least, they refused military service. When the Quakers in Stavanger did not baptize their children, did not marry in church, held their own funerals, they were punished. It was illegal not to follow the state church rituals. Either they were put in jail or they had to pay fine. That got Lars Kjellane thinking about moving, perhaps back to London. But William Allen asked him, why not go further west? Why not go to America? In America, you also can have the faith you want. Moreover, the land is cheap and easy to farm. Lars Kjellane liked this idea, and soon others in the Quakers community wanted to emigrate too. And they started to discuss how to prepare the emigration. And they decided to ask a man to go to America and check out the conditions with his own eyes. And the man who was chosen for this voyage of discovery was a special man, Kleng Persson. Kleng Persson had sailed in foreign trade, could speak English, a little German, a little French. He wanted to go. And in 1821, Kleng Persson, together with one of the young men from the community, sailed all the way around the Norwegian coast to Sweden and followed one boat from Göteborg to New York, a boat with iron on board. But he didn't come home that year, not the year after, and not the year after that. They wondered. But at springtime, 1824, Kleng Persson was back home, and then he could tell that William Allen was right. He was correct. There were religious freedom in America, and the land was cheap and easy to farm. When others in this area got to know this, many wanted to join the Quakers and emigrate. And again, they started to discuss how to do it. Again, Kleng Persson was asked this time to go ahead to America, to buy land and prepare the arrival of the rest of the group. And Kleng Persson went in the fall, 1824. At Christmas time, the deal was done. And then he wrote a letter home, and it started like this. Dear father, brother, sister, and friends, I'm glad to tell you that I'm happy and well in America. We sailed for 6 weeks, and then we arrived in New York, where I found my friends with good health. Friends? Yes, Quakers. Quakers he had met the first time he was over. And he told Whiter in the letter that the Quakers in New York had helped him to buy land, and the land was located upstate New York at the shore of Lake Ontario. There were a lot of woods. He had already cut some trees and built a house, bought a stove, and they could build more house before the winter came when the other had come over. He continued in the letter to tell them that the Quakers in New York had advised the rest of the group to buy a boat themselves, a boat that was not too big, and fill the bottom of it with iron. Iron was scarce in America at that time, and they could sell both the iron and the boat when they came over and got a lot of money. Kleng Persson ended his letter with telling them that he missed them all, and that he longed for that moment when they would meet again in the harbor of New York. At the same time, Lars Kjellane was in the process of planning the emigration on full time now. He had married one of the young girls that had come sailing to the meetings in 1818, Martha Eide. And now it was finally decided who really wanted to emigrate. And among the emigrants were several families with children in all ages, adult unmarried men, 15, 16 years old boys that would travel alone without their parents. But now Lars Kjellane also had to purchase a boat for the journey. He knew about in the little town south of Stavanger, Egersund, a boat called Restauration. But first of all, he had to raise money for the cost of restoration, $1,800. The most of the immigrants did not have much money, but one was prosperous. That was Johannes Steine. Johannes Steine from Suldal sold his own cargo boat and paid $1,200 of the $1,800 for restoration. So he became the official owner of the boat. So therefore, Johannes Steine, Lars Kjellane, went to Egersund in the beginning of May 1825, looked at the boat, bought it, sailed it back to Stavanger, and moored at one of the piers. May and June became a busy time for Lars Kjellane, that also was a ship carpenter. He and one of the young boys that should travel alone, crafted bunks below deck on the inside. The bunks was narrow, short, and so low that a man barely could turn around. And children had to lay 2 in each bunk, had 2 feet. Up on the deck, they made a galley, a small kitchen. They bought a stove with 4 legs, nailed the legs to the deck, and they built boxes for firewood and nailed it to the deck, kitchen boxes, nailed it to the deck, and at last they built a water tank and nailed it to the deck. At the same time, the immigrants that had farms at the countryside sold their farms, and people in town sold their houses, and they had to sell or give away everything they couldn't bring with to America. And the only thing a family could bring with to America had to get placed in a chest that was 5 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 2.5 feet high. That was for clothing, shoes, and other assets for the whole family for the rest of their life. The departure day approached. They were busy at the pier. The man bought irons from shipyards and traders around the city, carried it on board, placed it in the bottom of the boat, as they had been advised to do. And so came the families with their chests, carried them up the gangway to the deck, down the ladder, and placed them upon the iron, side by side, and upon each other. Oh, the chest's hooks were turned in the ceiling for hammocks. In that way, everybody got a place to sleep. So they brought on board boxes of food, dry meat, dry bread, dry fish, potato, peas, cheese, and drink, liquor, beer, and wine. Now, liquor, beer, and tea. Some even brought coffee. And Monday, in the middle of the day, Monday, the 4th of July, 1825, everybody was on board, packed together up on the deck. Men, young people, women, some of them were holding children in their hands. Some were holding smaller children on their arms. And one of the women had a child in her womb. That was Martha Eide, Lars Kjellån's wife. Some of the families had older children at the pier. Yes, a lot of people had gathered at the pier, but also older children that should remain in Norway. But Johannes Steine, the owner of the boat, he had 2 children. Martha Helena, that was 4.5 years, she was on board. And so we had a boy, 16 years old, Sven. Between, there had been 3 more children, they were all dead. But Sven was not on board and not at the pier. Sven had disappeared some days earlier and they couldn't find him anyway. They had seen for him all over Stavanger. And at last his father Johannes sailed into the fjords and found his son at home by his grandmother on the island Finnøy. Sven didn't want to go to America. He would stay at home with his grandmother. His father tried to convince him to join the emigrants. His mother was waiting for him. His sister was waiting for him. But Sven refused. He had decided. So his father Johannes had just one thing to do. Say goodbye to his 16 years old boy, well knowing they would never see each other again. That moment on board Restauration was a difficult time for many of them. Some of the adult men that was unmarried had their fiancé at the pier, and the chef, he had his pregnant wife and 6 children at the pier.
Joined with
His thought was to get hired in New York and come back to Norway. What happened is another story I'll not tell now. But the time had come. They untied moorings and left. And they lifted their hands and started to wave to all the people at the pier. And the people at the pier started to wave too, and some of them had to dry tears. While the people on board, when they have waited for a while, they all, like a choir, started to sing hymns when they left harbor. A strong northerly wind was blowing into the fjord these days, so Restauration, with the flag hoisted and the sail hoisted, had to start crossing. And when they passed a little fortress out in the fjord, they were saluted. The journey had begun. At least they thought so. They didn't know what one of the young boys was thinking. The boy called Jens Madland, he was 19 years old. He had both his father and mother on board, and he had 3 younger sisters. But Jens himself had never liked the idea to go to America, but he hadn't told anybody about it. But no, when he felt the waves, he became afraid and started to shout, I don't want to go to America. Let me go ashore. I'm 19 years old. I can take care of myself. I don't want to stay on this little boat for many weeks and then come to America and stay there for the rest of the life. Let me go ashore. Oh, the captain didn't know what to do, but he could talk with the boy's parents. And so he decided to let the boy go ashore. And in the evening, they sailed into a small harbor. And in the evening, it was Jens that waved to his family and the emigrants that left Norway. And no, when they left Norway, there were 52 passengers on board Restauration. The northerly wind remained the next few days when they crossed the North Sea toward the English Channel. After just 4.5 days, they sailed into a little harbor in the southern England. The plan was to refill water and buy a little fresh food. while the crew were preparing water supply, some of the women went ashore to buy a little fresh food. But as I told you, they didn't have much money, so the women brought with some liquor. They wanted to trade. They offer liquor for fresh food. Oh, when the captain and Lars-Kjellane detected this, they became terrified. They called the women on board in a hurry, and they untied moorings and left harbor immediately. The women didn't know it was strictly forbidden to trade liquor in English ports. So they could risk that both the captain and the crew were put in jail if they had been detected. So they didn't get time to refill water. But they had nice weather further south when they crossed the Bay of Biscay, when they proceeded along the coast of Portugal. 3.5 weeks, they had just nice weather, everything went well. When they came closer up to the coast of North Africa, the captain knew that there could be pirates in these waters. And he also knew that Restoration hadn't bought license from Algeria that protected them against the pirates. So everybody had to be aware to look around. Fortunately, no one appeared. But another problem did appear. The water tank was empty and there were little food left. Oh, they became hungry, but most of all, thirsty. But these people didn't complain loudly. They became apathetic, sitting at the deck. Then some of them saw a barrel floating in the sea. They asked for Lars-Kjellane to come and look. And Lars-Kjellane managed after a time, with help, to get this barrel on board. It must have been laying in the sea for a long time. It was completely overgrown. But it turned out to be the most delicious Madeira wine. No, they had Madeira wine to drink. But what about the children? Oh, they decided that everybody would get a little taste, just a little taste to be wet inside. The children get their taste. It didn't taste good. The young people, the women, they all went down in the bunks. At last, it was just the crew back on the deck. But they were so thirsty. They drank too much. And they fall asleep and were laying like dead flies on the deck. And were sleeping like stones. And therefore they lost control of Restoration that started to drift towards Funchal, the capital of Madeira. At the same time, some men were working down in the harbor of Funchal at the fort. And they saw this sailing ship coming drifting to harbor without the flag hoisted. What could that be? And they could see no one on board, no man that worked with a sail. A sailing ship without people on board. Oh yes, there were people on board, but they must be sick or perhaps dead. Oh, perhaps it was a plague ship and they didn't want a plague ship to harbor. They shot warning shots with the guns. No reaction. The man was still sleeping. Then they directed the gun muzzles towards the ship, ready for firing. Luckily, at that time, a sailing ship from German was laying at anchor at the harbor in Funchal. And the crew saw the danger. The gun muzzles and the sailing ship, and they started to shout to Restoration, hoist flag, you have to hoist flag. No reaction. The man was still sleeping. But a woman came running up on the deck. Her name was Bertha from Tysvær. The flag, she didn't know where the flag was. Oh, then she saw the gun muzzles that was directed to her ship, and she understood, and she ran forward to the bow. And there she tore off her skirt, and standing in bare legs, she started to wave with the skirt intensely. And with her skirt, Bertha prevented the first Norwegian emigrant ship to be firing at the harbor of Madeira. Later, the Portuguese custom collectors boarded the ship and found that everything else was okay. And when they came ashore, they were met by the American consul on the island. And he invited all 52 home, and they got a meal they later never forgot. That was the 1st of August. 1 month had passed since they left home. They stayed on Madeira for 6 days, and it became a pleasant stay. The children could now run around, play, and swim. And for the adults, especially for Martha Eide, it was good to come ashore and feel the ground under her feet. Yes, because Martha Eide now was pregnant in her 8th month. After 6 days, they were ready for the further journey. And the water tank was filled up, and they got a lot of food and a lot of grapes from the American consul. When they left harbor, they were saluted. Good luck on the journey. Now they sailed in the direction of the Canary Island, and there they turned course westward and followed the trade wind. Restoration plowed its way slowly but surely westwards. During the days, they had just blue sea and blue sky. And during the nights, they had the mighty dark skies with all the stars above. They had much good weather on this first part of the journey. One of the men had been a teacher before they left, so now and then he gathered the children on the deck and had lessons in the sun in the middle of the Atlantic. They also had meetings on board twice a week. Then they were sitting tight together under the big sails, praying, reading the Bible, perhaps singing, but most of the time they were sitting quiet together. But the trade wind could blow strongly. Oh, it could be storm. And when the wind was storm, the waves were big, so big that they could not stand up on the deck. Everybody had to go under the deck, and there were not much space. They had to lay in their bunks. And when they became sick, they had to use just some few buckets. The smell inside could be really bad, and they could also be pretty afraid. But after some days, the weather became better. They could open up and got fresh air and eat again. They sailed for about 4 weeks. Then they came close up to the Bahamas. And when there were 2 days before they reached Bahamas, something specially happened because the women took control. Men that were resting in the bunks were driven up on the deck, young people, children up on the deck. And so was the room below deck converted into a delivery room. The time had come for Martha Eide. And with help with one of the women that had been a midwife before they left, she gave birth to a healthy little, it was a little girl. And when the girl's father came down, she immediately got the same name as the Quaker lady in London, Margaret Allen. Margaret Allen was born the 2nd of September, 1825. 2 months had passed since they left home. From the Bahamas and north to New York, they spent 1 more month on board. No, they had much bad weather. But they had come safely across the Atlantic. A new child was born. So now the close relationship between the passengers started to give results. Young, pretty Rachel Madland, 18 years old, sister of Jens that had left in Norway. Yes, she must have been looking around, and some man must have looking around too, because she and the captain himself became a couple on board. And not only Rachel, her younger sister, later called, her name was Guri, later called Julia. She also found a lover, 10 years older than herself, Gudmund Haukås. They become a couple, and both of them married some years later. But they had one more sister, Serena, just 11 years old. She learned to know one of the young boys that was going alone to America, Jacob Slogvik. They didn't become a couple on board, but they married 6 years later. They sailed up the coast of East America. Days, weeks, months had passed, and the fall had come. And surprisingly, they sailed around the Long Island tip and in Long Island Sound. And in the morning, Sunday, the 9th of October, they reached Hell Gate. Hell Gate is the narrow strait with a lot of islands and underwater rocks. Very dangerous place at that time. The tide flew with big speed through the strait. Many ships had wrecked there. But the crew of Restoration sailed the ship safely through Hell Gate and into East River. And in the morning, the 9th of October, Restoration proceeded down East River with Manhattan, with small farms and pastures at the starboard side and Long Island at the port side. After a time, they saw south on Manhattan, the big city of New York coming up with higher houses than they never had seen, with more than 100,000 inhabitants, and the little town of Brooklyn at the port side. They sailed south on Manhattan and moored at the piers of Borman and Johnson. The little ship on the big port of New York was noticed. Already next day, Monday, the 10th of October, a New York commercial advertiser, a newspaper, wrote that a little ship had come all the way from Norway, surprisingly around Long Island Sound, with a lot of people on board and with the captain, Hella. 2 days later, Wednesday, the 12th of October, another newspaper, New York Daily Advertiser, could tell more. Under the heading, "A novel sight," the newspaper told that a little ship had come all the way from the area around Cape Stavanger in Norway. They had sailed for 14 weeks. Men and women, young people and children, but they seemed to be with good health and good spirit, all of them. And I quote further from this newspaper this Wednesday, 12th of October. "The appearance of such a group of strangers coming from so a distant country in a vessel ill calculated for the voyage could not but make an unusual degree of interest. Those who come from countryside are dressed in coarse cloth of domestic manufacture, in a fashion quite different from the American." Oh, the article was much longer, and it was reproduced in several newspapers, both in Boston, Philadelphia, and Rochester. When they came ashore, they were met by Kling Persson. It was a hearty reunion. But the first Norwegian emigrants also were met by Quakers. They invited them home to stay in their houses on Manhattan the first night. Lars Kjellane, His wife, Martha, and the little Margaret Allen stayed at home with Lydia Glacier and her husband, and they became so good friends that when Lars Yelan and Martha later got a girl, they gave her the name Lydia Glacier. It was so good with this hearty welcome, trouble soon should appear. And the first that happened was that Restoration was taken under arrest and the captain put in jail. And they who thought they had come to the land of freedom, what could that be? According to a new American law of 1819, boat with the size as Restoration could have just a third of them as passengers. And for that, they got a fine of $3,000, money they simply didn't have. They didn't have money. The plan was to sell Restoration and the iron and buy boat tickets. What should they do? They had to come up to Candle and build more house before the first winter came. But they had friends, the Quakers. One of them gave them a loan of $600 for boat tickets, and members of the community came with baskets with food and drink for the ride. No, they had decided that Cleng Persson should lead the group up to Candle, and Lars Yelan should remain in New York together with the captain in jail. But first of all, they had to carry everything from the boat from Restoration down the gangway to the pier and up the gangway to a steamer that were laying at Battery Park. Everything went well until the young Jacob Slogvik, 18 years old, came down the gangway with his precious carpenter's tools in his hands, tools he has got from his parents. He walked down the gangway, but then he stumbled and lost the tools in the water. He lost what should be his help to start a new life in America. But the steamer took them up Hudson River, and that was a pleasant trip. The sun was warming, even if it was fall, warming on the deck. And the trees along the river were standing in autumn colors. After 1.5 days, they came to the city of Albany. There they again went ashore with all their stuff and chests and small children. Now they should change boat because they should travel on the new constructed Erie Canal. The canal boats did not have the steam engine, no accommodation, horses or mules went on the towpath. And at that way, it took its time to travel on Erie Canal. They had to stop for each 15 miles to change horses and mules. They had to stop for locks, and they had to stop each evening to find a place to eat and drink and sleep. It became a drawn-out trip, and soon they come in short of food and drink. They became thirsty, hungry, and tired. After 8 days and 8 nights, they reached a little canal town with the name Halle. Again, they went ashore, but no, they had to walk 9 miles on their feet, carrying everything through the wood to Candle. But they came to Candle. But what they met and how their lives became is another story I'll not tell now, perhaps next year. But I will reveal what happened in New York, because in New York, the Restoration was released and the captain set free with help of the American president himself, John Quincy Adams. Some of the Quakers in New York knew the president, and he listened to them and he believed them that the Norwegian didn't know this law of 1980. But Lars Yelan had to remain in New York because his task was to sell both Restoration and the iron. But that was not an easy job to do, because No one wanted to buy the boat. And first, in the beginning of December, he had sold both the boat and the iron. But he got only $400 for both of them. And they had bought only Restoration for $1,800. But he took the steamer up Hudson River, came to Albany. No, the canal had frozen and the boat stopped for the winter. What should he do? But Lars-Geir always found advice. He bought skates and went skating on the canal. For 30 miles he went skating. And he reached Halle and he came to Kendal and met his little daughter, his wife, and the rest of the emigrants before the first snow was falling before Christmas in 1825. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Anne. What a story. May I ask you one question? What happened to the boat? What happened to Restoration?
To Restoration, yes. What happened to Restoration? No one could tell me about that, and I wonder what happened to it. So my husband, that is an historian, and we went to Historical Society in New York, and my husband asked for the newspaper from November, December 1825 for January, February, March 1826. And we were sitting side by side, browsing this newspaper, looking for Restoration. And we found some sale ads, but we read, and in February, we found a little notice that told us that Restoration was, the sloop Restoration was going to sail to St. Thomas, and there were room for some passengers. St. Thomas. Then we, 2 years later, went to St. Thomas, to Charlotte Amalia, the capital, and in the archives there, we again were sitting reading newspaper, this time on microfilm. Oh, it was terrible to read about all the ads of slave for sales and with family and without family at, St. Thomas and 2 other islands in the Caribbean was Danish, Norwegian slave colonies. But we were looking for Restoration. And at last we found that Restoration again was for sale. And sometimes later we found that who had bought Restoration. It was a businessman on the island St. Croix or St. Croix, they say in Denmark, further south in Caribbean. And there were also the name of who would sail the boat to St. Croix. And 2 years after that, in 2016, my husband and I took a flight to St. Croix. And we found the house, the street number, the house where the ship owner had lived. But there were no more to find because there were no oral tradition to find. And the archives from 1820 to 1816 had burned down in a slave revolt. So now we just can imagine that the ship Restoration ended his days sailing among the islands in Caribbean between the slave colonies. That's what we think happened.
Yeah, so quite a journey for the boat as well, from Hardanger in Norway to the islands in the Caribbean. Quite amazing. Can you tell us a little bit about your own storytelling activity? How did you become interested in telling stories as you have done for us this afternoon?
I think it must have to do with my old father. I love to listen to him telling stories from his childhood and from his time as a sailor when he was young. He was sailing in the 20s and 30s all over the world. And I think I learned of him to tell, because when I was 7 and started school, we had my friends and I had to walk for an hour to school, and we were going and talk to each other, and sometimes we told each other stories. And I love to tell dreams, and sometimes I put my friends into the dreams, and I liked it so much that they asked me, "Oh, can't you tell it in the school, in the classroom? We asked the teacher." And so they did. And I had to tell the story that I just created for the other pupils. And so I learned to tell stories. I was or loved to tell sometimes. But when I became a teacher myself, I used storytelling to get the attention of the student. And something I want to say is, in the 1990s, storytelling became a subject, an art subject on university level that was able to study. And I started studying storytelling. And after that, I established my own storytelling business. And later, I partly have it as a livelihood.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, this story certainly came alive because of your storytelling today. So thank you so much. We have a couple of questions, and but we also a bit short on time. So I would like to share with you that there is apparently a list of the passengers on the vessel that can be explored further. And it is the link to it has been shared in the chat box as well. So I suppose it's for us to explore further if you want to do that. Your time is running very fast. So I promised you a surprise towards the end of the meeting. And the surprise is that we have a guest in the room that is directly descending from one of the people that we have heard about in the story shared by Anne. You remember Lars? Lars Geilane, that, as you called him, Anne. I think it's Lars Larson. That is another way he has been known. When we have a descendant of Lars in the room. So, Jill, please present yourself.
Good morning. This has been a wonderful presentation. I found myself getting very emotional hearing this story. Lars Larson and Martha were my third great grandparents. And there's another person in the room that I received a call from back in May of 2010. And that was Per Ingebo, who used to work for the Norwegian Emigration Society. And this telephone call came to ask me if I might be interested in coming to Stavanger to christen the recreation of the ship Restauration, which had been built by hardworking boat builders whom I met while I was there. Jorn may also be here in this chat. So what happened was that they had engaged the Queen to christen the ship in June of 2010. And the Queen had to go to Sweden for the princess's wedding. And therefore, they were looking for a descendant to christen the ship, a descendant of Lars and Martha Larson. And they found my name on a website that my son had created of our ancestry. And so I get a call from Norway. And the Immigration Society paid for my flight over, for my room and board, and also paid the airfare for my son, Scott, who's also a genealogist. And we arrived in Stavanger on a Monday. And our cousin, Harold, whose father descended from a brother of Lars Larson, spent the entire week with us taking us not only to see the home sites of Lars and his family, but also his ancestry. We went to Helland and we went to Taxtal. We went to the home places where Lars Larsson's ancestors lived. And so I had a delightful week, almost a week in Stavanger and the area around. We went to the island of Fong, which is where Marta was from, and visited with the people who were interested in telling their story about this group of people. But the rest of the story is that I had lived for 20 years in Rochester. The little town that I lived in is called Fairport, which is just outside southeast of Rochester. And the Erie Canal runs right through Fairport. In fact, the Main Street Bridge crosses over the canal. So I had been familiar with Lars Larson, and I had known a lot about his history. I had read the books. I have a book called The Sloopers, which had been written in the 1960s that I bought a copy of. So I knew a little bit about him. And I also knew that he had been buried in Rochester. So I had gone to the cemetery to find his tombstone. And in the process found that the tombstone, which is on a really precipitous incline, had fallen over and it was like upside down in the mud. And so I went to the cemetery office and I said, you know, you have a very famous person buried in this cemetery and I need help having his stone set upright again because it's fallen over. And they did not know the story of Lars Larson, even though the face of the stone clearly says that he was the leader of the first Norwegian migration to America. So they set the stone up straight. And then they told me that they have a little quarterly publication called The Epitaph for Mount Hope Cemetery. And they asked me if I would be interested in writing a little story about Lars Larson and who he was. And so I did that way back in the 1980s that I had written the story for The Epitaph. The other thing about Lars is when he came to Kendal, he wasn't really a farmer. He didn't really like farming. And so he moved very quickly after that into the city of Rochester. And he built a house in an area of the city that's called Cornhill. It used to be a place where the people in the city would raise their corn. It was a little rise in the city. And so Atkinson Street, which is where he decided to build his house, was in the Cornhill area. A rather affluent area. But his mission then was to be a ship carpenter. The opening of the Erie Canal, which had just occurred just prior to the sloopers' arrival, needed a special kind of boat because in each little town, the crossing of the canal was done by very low bridges. They were very, very low. In fact, we used to have a song when I grew up there in that area about low bridge, everybody down, low bridge, we're coming to a town. So the boats that had to travel on the Erie Canal, whether they be boats that carried lumber or goods to the Midwest, or whether they were passenger vessels, they had to be very wide and very low to get under those bridges and to carry, you know, a reasonable number of people or products. So Lars Larson formed a boatyard, and the boatyard is called the Larson Boatyard, and it was at the joining of the Genesee River and Lake Ontario. And he went into the business of building packet boats, which is what those boats were called, because he knew that there was a demand, now that this newly built canal was open, for more boats that could actually go from Albany all the way to Lake Erie and then travel through the Great Lakes and get to the Midwest with passengers and produce. His home on Atkinson Street in Rochester became a way station for succeeding boatloads of people who came from Norway. He actually bought a second house on Atkinson Street so that he could put up passengers for a period of time until they kind of got acclimated to America. At one time, I have a letter that said that they had 19 people staying with them in their homes until the people felt comfortable to get on another boat and head even further west to the Midwest, Illinois and Minnesota and so on and so forth. So when I was asked to christen the ship in downtown Stavanger, I was asked to give a talk, very much like the gentleman offered me an opportunity to do today. And my talk was picking up at the very same place where our speaker today had left off. What's the rest of the story? And the rest of the story is that Lars Larson earned a living in downtown Rochester, building packet boats for the Erie Canal. Unfortunately, he met an untimely death. He was drowned in the canal. He was delivering a boat down toward the Mohawk River, and he was on a bridge over the canal. And for some reason, he lost his footing and drowned in the canal. So Marta continued to live on Atkinson Street and continued to be a hospitable hostess to all of the Norwegian immigrants who came after.
Oh, I just wanted to say that I listened to you. I saw you. I was on the replica of Restoration when you christened the ship. So I remember you. I think you had something blue on you, and I remember so much the noise of Queen Mary that say hello to you just after you had boiled it. So I remember you very well. So it was so nice to see you. And I also say that I've stand in Atkinson Street and looked, oh, what house can it be? Or I know this house isn't there anymore. So yes, I feel familiar with with and why I just say why I call him Lars Geilane is because the little farm he lived on in Stavanger was named Geilane, and in Norway it's usual to name people after the farm. But I know he have a written other name. So, but that's why I say Geilane, because
Right.
that's the farm name. So
Well,
nice
that
to
really
see
helps
you.
when you're doing genealogical research to have that farm name, because you can tell then where to look for the people. Like before the Geilane name, it was Helen, and so that's why we knew we had to go to Helen, this little town in Rogaland County, to see where his father and his grandfather lived. And then the farm name before that was Taxtell. So it really helps do your research in Norway to have the farm name. But when he came to America, he dropped his farm name and he was just known as Lars Larson.
Okay.
Yeah.
There you
So,
go.
but it's nice to know that you were there that day. That was the trip of a lifetime to
No,
be welcome to Stavanger and making friends who have remained friends of mine on Facebook all these years.
Well, thank you so much, Jill. Thank you for sharing a wonderful follow-up to the story that we've heard this afternoon and evening. And I think that can be the sort of the close, bring us to the close of this meeting as well. I would like to say one more time, thank you so much, Anne Elisebeth, for a wonderful presentation.
Yes.
I had the fortune of looking at the faces of people while you were talking, and I know that you had their attention. So you achieved exactly what you were planning to do, and it was a fascinating story to listen to. So thank you so much for that, and thank you so much, Jill, for sharing your story as well. A wonderful follow-up to the story presented by Anne Elisebeth. And with those words, I think we are close to the end. Lars, anything you would like to say before we close the meeting? You have to unmute yourself, Lars.
I thought it was a great meeting, and it was great to hear the story again, and especially to meet Jill in person. We had spoken earlier in the week. And I do want to thank Helge for doing this, putting together the program. We have two people that have helped you. That is Garrett, your woman and Cindy, who have helped us with the IT stuff to make this possible. Thank you very much. I'm sorry we don't have flowers for everybody, but we'll have to do with that. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Lars, and thank you, everybody. Thank you. I see some applause, and that's nice in a setting as well. Thank you so much for letting me moderate this meeting. I think we're done. Enjoy the rest of the day. Enjoy the evening. Enjoy the afternoon. Stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.